Our story begins with the mighty waves of human migration in search of a better life. Between the years of 1880 and 1914, millions left Eastern Europe and set sail for the United States. But this influx was met with suspicion and fear, which ultimately birthed strict immigration laws. The consequences of these laws, especially for the persecuted Jews, would be more dire than anyone could have anticipated. From economic turmoil, political maneuverings, to the dark rise of authoritarian rule, this tale is filled with foreboding preludes. You might be wondering, preludes to what? A catastrophe like no other, the worst genocide in human history. But the pivotal event, the tipping point that escalated these dark times into the abyss. You'll find out soon enough. What's up, my amazing and curious folks? Ready to dive deep into the mysteries of our world? I'm your host, Caesar, and with me is Sonia, our insightful commentator. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that bell icon to stay updated.
Hey everyone, really excited to delve into today's topic with you all.
Now let's delve deeper into this dark chapter of history, starting with the United States immigration quotas. Between 1880 and 1914, a remarkable 7.5 million people from Eastern Europe migrated to the United States. This massive influx sparked fear among many white Protestant Americans, worrying about being outnumbered by the arriving Roman Catholics and Jews. Parallels can be eerily drawn with today's contentious debates around immigration and displacement. By 1924, well before the rise of Hitler and the Great Depression, strict immigration laws were put into place, severely limiting the number of immigrants allowed from Eastern and Southern Europe. Little did they know, these laws would later block a crucial potential haven for persecuted Jews in the coming years. Fast forward a few years to the onset of the Great Depression. The global economic meltdown was a catalyst in the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. The economic hardship faced by Germany, coupled with Hitler's insidious use of anti-Semitic rhetoric to place blame for their woes, was a deadly mix. And while it's difficult to definitively say, the Holocaust may not have happened if the world wasn't already grappling with such economic devastation. But of course, this is just the beginning of the story. The economic crash of 1929 hit Germany hard. Unemployment rose to 24% and desperation seeped into society. This paved the way for Adolf Hitler and his Nazi Party, who cunningly exploited this fear and desperation, blaming Jews and communists for the country's economic woes.
It's truly disturbing how quickly fear and desperation can become tools for manipulation.
Indeed, it's a stark reminder of the power of rhetoric and the dangers of unaddressed socioeconomic issues. Hitler's party won a whopping 95-seat gain in the Reichstag, and he himself ran a strong campaign for president. Despite losing, he was appointed chancellor in 1933.
Wasn't there some controversy around his appointment?
Yes, the incumbent president, Paul von Hindenburg, had deep reservations about Hitler, but ultimately appointed him to form a more governable coalition. A decision that would soon lead to disaster.
And that disaster started with the Reichstag Fire, right?
Exactly. Barely a month after Hitler's appointment, the Reichstag, the seat of Germany's government, was set ablaze. Authorities arrested a Dutch immigrant with communist sympathies, but many believe it was a staged event by the Nazis, a false flag operation. Regardless, Hitler used the incident to pass the decree for the protection of the people and the state, a law that effectively stripped people of their individual rights in the name of safety. It marked the beginning of an era of severe repression and violence.
It's chilling to think how a catastrophic event can be used to justify such extreme measures. It's a sobering reminder of how important it is to safeguard our rights and liberties.
Hitler's consolidation of power was alarming. Following the Reichstag Fire, all non-Nazi political parties and labor unions had been eradicated by the close of 1933. After von Hindenburg's death the next year, Hitler merged the offices of president and chancellor, effectively becoming the Führer.
And this was the starting point for the harsh anti-Jewish policies, right?
In 1935, Hitler introduced the Nuremberg Laws, which institutionalized many of the racist ideas central to Nazi ideology. Jews were stripped of their citizenship, barred from marrying non-Jews, and expelled from the army. In Dusseldorf, Jews were even denied access to hospitals.
That's horrifying to think about. These laws essentially isolated the Jewish community from the rest of society.
It didn't stop at social exclusion. The economic ruin soon followed. All major Jewish-owned enterprises were transferred to non-Jews. Jewish managers and workers were fired. By 1938, Jewish-owned businesses had been reduced by 2/3.
Wasn't there a brief pause in these persecutions around 1936? I think it had something to do with the Olympics.
Correct. Germany hosted both the Summer and Winter Olympics that year, and eager to maintain a veneer of tolerance for the international community, eased its anti-Semitic policies temporarily. However, in 1937, the persecution of Jews accelerated again, with Jews being forced to register their property with the government, a clear precursor to further confiscation.
It seems like the Nazis were tightening the noose around the Jewish community. But there's one event that stands out in this grim history, isn't there?
Yes, that would be Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. It marked a significant escalation in the Nazi persecution of the Jews, but we'll delve into that in our next segment. The event known as Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, marked a significant escalation in the Nazi persecution of the Jews. This happened after a 17-year-old Polish-German Jew, Herschel Grinspan, killed a German embassy official in Paris in response to his parents' deportation.
So, Hitler used this isolated incident as a pretext to launch widespread attacks on the Jewish community.
Exactly. Hitler's response was far from proportionate. He initiated a full-blown pogrom against Jews under the guise of it being spontaneous civilian responses. These responses were actually government-sanctioned purges.
And this was the first instance of mass arrest justified strictly by Jewishness, right?
Yes, approximately 30,000 Jewish males were arrested and sent to concentration camps. Hitler also imposed a staggering 1 billion Reichsmark atonement tax on the Jewish community. This was a cruel form of punishment, making the victims pay for the destruction of their own infrastructure.
That's just horrifying to think about. But amidst all this, I recall a heartbreaking incident about a ship filled with Jewish refugees.
That would be the MS St. Louis. In May 1939, the German liner set sail from Hamburg with almost 940 Jewish passengers on board, hoping to find refuge in Cuba. However, they were turned away by President Federico Laredo Bru, leaving the terrified passengers stranded at sea. That incident exemplifies the harsh reality of the time, that even those who managed to flee the horrors of their homeland were often left with nowhere to go. The St. Louis eventually had to return to Europe, where several Western European countries agreed to take in the refugees.
But they weren't necessarily safe there, were they?
No, they weren't. Hitler eventually invaded all but England. In the end, 254 of the ship's 937 passengers died in the Holocaust.
That's heartbreaking to hear. And Hitler's reign of terror was far from over.
Right. Hitler had long-term ambitions. He professed our colonial territories in the East and initiated what historians term settler colonialism.
This is where the original inhabitants are exploited and replaced by the conqueror's people, correct?
Yes, Hitler was so focused on eastward expansion that he made a fatal mistake. He invaded the vast Soviet Union in June of 1941.
Instead of focusing on consolidating his power in the countries he had already occupied.
Exactly. As the Reich pushed eastward, Germany continued to seize lands with high Jewish populations.
Hitler seemed to take a page from American history in this regard.
Indeed. He often cited the United States' destruction of Native American peoples during its 19th century westward expansion as a precedent.
And as the Nazis took over more and more territory, the Jewish population under their control grew, right?
Yes. Compared to just 525,000 in pre-war Germany, there were millions of Jews in Poland and the USSR. The problem Hitler faced was that simply marginalizing them was no longer viable.
Which leads us to one of the darkest chapters of this history, the concentration camps and ghettos, correct?
Yes, exactly. But that's a topic that requires its own segment, and we'll delve into that next. The systematic displacement and imprisonment of Jews grew more normalized as the years went on. Concentration camps were established as early as 1934, but became widespread by the late 30s. The invasion of Poland marked a turning point.
And the notorious camps like Auschwitz and Treblinka were established during this time, right?
Yes, Auschwitz was established in 1940, and Treblinka followed a year later. Many of these camps were conveniently located near factories or sites designed to extract raw materials. Prisoner labor was exploited to produce goods for Nazi-owned companies, simultaneously enriching the Reich and bolstering their war machine.
You know, it's chilling to think about how these horrific institutions were seen as a way to solve their Jewish problem. The calculated nature of it all is just mind-boggling.
Absolutely. And to keep the flow of Jews into these work camps steady, the Nazis herded Jews into walled ghettos, like the infamous Warsaw Ghetto, where more than 90,000 Jews died from disease and starvation.
While we're on the topic of ghettos, did you know that the word ghetto actually originated from Venice, Italy? It was an area where Jews were compelled to live in the 16th century, and from there, the term spread to other parts of Europe.
Yes, that's true. The original ghetto in Venice was named after the foundry, Gato, in Venetian, that was located there. Back to the topic. By the war's end, there were as many as 44,000 concentration camps established.
And these weren't just labor camps.
No, gas chambers were used for mass killings, with the first instance of en masse gas chamber murders taking place in September 1941 at Auschwitz.
Meanwhile, despite all of this, the U.S. State Department was making it difficult for Jews to seek shelter in America, right?
Yes, immigration quotas were one obstacle, but the State Department itself was filled with prejudiced bureaucrats who did nothing to help. Assistant Secretary Samuel Breckinridge Long is a prime example. He began his term in January of 1940, just months after the St. Louis incident and a year after the Kristallnacht attacks. He imposed lengthy, multi-layered vetting processes for any European seeking asylum, using the excuse that Nazi spies could be hiding among the refugees. Unfortunately, the situation did not improve as time went on. Samuel Breckinridge Long made it incredibly difficult for Jewish refugees to come to America. In fact, he instructed the Visa Division to outright reject applications from people with relatives living in Nazi-controlled territory.
And he continued to bury his head in the sand as reports of the Holocaust came in.
Indeed, he disputed and downplayed news reports of mass murder during the Holocaust. When called to testify in November of 1943, he wildly overstated the number of Jewish refugees America had admitted.
His actions really were a disgrace.
Yes, and eventually in January of 1944, his suppression of information regarding the Nazi slaughter was discovered. He was reassigned and resigned in November of that year.
So while this was happening in the U.S., what was Hitler doing?
October of 1941 marked a major turning point. Until then, Hitler had been fine with most Jews simply fleeing his regime. But then he almost entirely rescinded emigration.
So there was no escape.
Right. It wasn't until mid to late 1941 that Hitler embraced what became known as the final solution, the systematic extermination of the Jews of Europe.
And once that decision was made, things escalated rapidly.
Yes, the vast majority of the Jews killed in the Holocaust died over the next 3+ years. In Poland alone, more than half its pre-war Jewish population, some 1.7 million people, were slaughtered largely in gas chambers.
And in Ukraine, even more were killed.
Yes, another 1.5 million were exterminated, mostly by firing squads. As the war turned and Nazi troops retreated back toward Germany, they took the Holocaust with them. By the fall of Berlin, 2/3 of the Jews in Europe had been murdered.
It's a horrifically dark chapter in human history.
Our exploration into this dark chapter of human history is drawing to a close, but it's crucial we remember and acknowledge these atrocities. As the Nazis retreated, they didn't leave their horrific practices behind. Emaciated Jews were marched ahead of their tanks and trucks, a final act of dehumanization. By the time Berlin fell, 2/3 of the Jews in Europe had been murdered, marking the most heinous war crime in mankind's history. And there we have it, a deeply troubling but important journey through the preludes to the Holocaust. From U.S. immigration quotas to the rise of Hitler and the implementation of anti-Semitic laws, the stage was tragically set for the worst mass murder in human history. These 10 foreboding preludes remind us of the importance of being vigilant and standing up against hatred and intolerance at every turn.
It's a chilling reminder of how easily a society can be manipulated into accepting the unthinkable. We hope this episode has been informative and thought-provoking. If you found it valuable, please hit that like button, leave a comment, and share this episode with your friends.
We appreciate your time and your willingness to delve into these tough topics with us.
Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and above all, never forget. Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye. This insightful article titled 10 Foreboding Preludes to the Holocaust was penned by Christopher Dale and published on the 1st of November 2023 on Listverse. For those interested in delving deeper, you can find the full URL in our episode description. Now I'm signing off.